Hey, welcome to The View. I'm Meg Riley in Minneapolis. Excited today to bring special guest Keith Kron, who will talk to us about the ministerial search and find process. But first, let's have our regulars say hello. And what's up with you? Patrice, what's up with you?
We can talk now, yeah, right?
Talk later. All is pretty good here. I'm in Washington, D.C. Hi, everybody. Patrice Curtis. The weather is, around here, we're kind of saying it's stupidly cold right now. We had this beautiful 70s weather about 3 days ago, and last night it turned cold, and right now it's only about 47, and it's gray and yucky, and I think the last time I was with you, I said winter was kicking and screaming.
All right, the weather. Come on.
Yeah, come on.
Come on. What else is going on?
There's a reason. All right, that's it for me.
Seriously, you're going to stop there. All right. Joanna, come on.
Well, hi, I'm Joanna Fontaine Crawford, and I am here in Austin, Texas, where, we're already starting to feel the heat. I remember, Meg, you and I talking about you in fall with the winter approaching, and we kind of feel that way, when it gets about this time of year.
And I'm Hank Purse in murky Medford, Massachusetts. And life is good here. It's been busy. I got some stuff to say about the bombing trial in a moment, but it's good to be with you all.
You look like you got Vaseline on your lens today. Are you trying to look sultry, or?
What do you mean trying?
Aisha, sorry I interrupted.
Oh no, all good. I'm Aisha Hauser in Seattle. It's beautiful and sunny, and it's been perpetual spring. We barely had winter, so that's all I have to say about the weather.
There you go. And behind that chalice, we have Bob LaValle, who's doing tech for us today. Thanks, Bob. And happily, we're all here. That's good news. As you'll recall, a few weeks ago, Keith tried to be here. He tried really hard.
We're not all here.
And, well, no. Everybody was coming. Tom can't come today. So, but nobody is on the outside clawing at the windows the way that Aisha and Keith and I were several weeks ago. Anyway, it's great to see everyone. So, Hank, you want to talk about the Boston bomber thing? What's it like to be there?
Yeah, it's interesting. Certainly first of all, the second anniversary of the bombing's coming up in just very shortly, within a week or two, and the bombing trial finished yesterday. All of came back very quickly from the jury, guilty on all 30 counts, and it's a federal case. There's lots of questions about whether or not it should be tried in Massachusetts, whether it should be tried out of state, or at least out of Boston, and but the feds, came in and said, no, we're going to do this, and and since it's a federal case, the death penalty is involved. Massachusetts does not have the death penalty, and so there's just lots of feelings back and forth. Certainly, I think in part because it's the anniversary, you have a lot more people remembering, how horrible it was 2 years ago, but I'm also, pleased to see people really, being glad that the case went ahead and went very smoothly, and then people are also sort of saying, and let's not put him to death. Let's not let's let him spend the rest of his life in jail, and I've seen
on Facebook this whole discussion of how life in jail without parole is just a really elongated death penalty. Is that conversation taking place publicly? That what is?
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it too much. I've a friend who writes for the Globe, and who wrote about the death penalty, and she's been posting some of the mail she's been getting, from people being very angry with her, sort of saying that there shouldn't be a life in jail. He should just be killed, and it's sad, and it's and I certainly I understand people's anger. And it's I've got friends. I didn't know anyone who died, but I had friends, good friends who had who were close to one of the people who died, and so it's just painful and sad, and so it's just an interesting time right now to be in Boston and be a minister, and ministering to folks with both senses of what they feel should happen.
People here have strong opinions about that. I'm curious.
Well, the thing that this case has brought up for me is the fact that we know that the executive function of our brains doesn't really completely form until we're 25 or 26. And the thing that, and maybe even 28, who knows, and that ability to really be reflective, to perhaps resist familial pressure to do something, to really understand the impact of what we do, especially, they've looked at violence and how, games make people think, that it's kind of a game, and it's not really understanding the full impact, that the violence is real, that when something blows up, it's really going to have this impact. And beyond this case, it's just made me really think about how we treat sort of 18 to 25, 26-year-olds, and how it feels to me like somehow we're failing them, though I really haven't gotten any deeper than that. But it just feels like there's something wrong with our approach as we have our youth, mature into young adulthood. It just feels like somehow we're missing something, and that's as far as I've gotten. But it's really made me really think about that. Like somehow something is not right. About how we support that age group.
Thanks for saying that, Patrice, because that's what I've been thinking about since he was the one found in the boat, and it was the older brother who was clearly the mastermind. And I just kept thinking, like, this is an even more unkind thought, but I wished it was the older brother on trial and the younger brother was spared all this, because it feels like he was the one. And that's what I keep thinking. My daughter's 17, and I'm like, God, 2 years. From he was 19, I think, when he was arrested and caught, and it feels so tragic. And I can't help but feel sympathy for him. No, I didn't have anyone die. I wasn't maimed, so I get the anger, of course. And I feel like, thank you, you articulated it beautifully, that's exactly how I've been feeling. I feel bad for him, and it does feel like we're failing a whole group of young people. So thank you for that.
To me, I think where I feel, where I've been thinking about it, because, CLF has a prison ministry. We have about 600 prisoners. And it feels like, Calvinism is what the prison system's all about. It's not about, here, let's try to redeem your life. Let's offer you the tools to actually live a meaningful life. Let's correct where it went wrong. It's more, let's punish you, and isolate you, and, kind of, like if you weren't really disturbed going in, by the time you spent some time in solitary confinement because you got on someone's nerves or whatever, you're going to have a really hard time when you come out with PTSD and other things, and not to mention all of the federal and state laws that prohibit you from having much of a meaningful life. So I just think about, like, what is the purpose of prison? It's certainly to get dangerous people away from hurting other people. I'm for that. I don't want to be hurt by people on the street. Mm-hmm. But I don't feel like that's mostly what it is now. It's mostly a huge, let's punish you, you're bad, isolate you. It feels like, Calvinism in action to me. You're sinners, you can't be redeemed. Yeah, and some of it's for profit with the privatization of prisons. And some of those privatized prisons have contracts that say they'll always be full. So anyway, that's not related to this case particularly, but just my thinking about prisons and how, with the people who find CLF, which by the way is completely word of mouth, they're just longing for something that's about kindness and openness and welcoming people as they are, and they take such a tiny bit of that and go so far with it, and I just see them, starving for that. And so you think, well, if he spends life in prison, that's so that he will just be punished day after day after day after day till he eventually dies at some point. So, you know, it's the redemption song I want to sing. Joanna, you look like you're coming in.
Yeah, Hank, I remember the night of the manhunt, I was on Twitter with you and, 200 of your closest friends. And, you and several others were, it was in real time, and you were talking about, oh, wow, there are police cars right outside my door, and, other people were posting about that. Do you think that feeling of that it was personal, that it was in people's neighborhoods, do you think that's part of the emotion underneath all of this right now?
I think so, and the fact that the case has wrapped up right now as well, which I think is also part of it. It's it being so close to the anniversary of all this. So I think there's that. I mean, I'm there, and I'm certainly seeing on my Facebook and Twitter feed people on both sides, calling for the death penalty, and others not, and I'm, I guess I'm glad that there's that people are saying what they feel, and that people are taking that and you have and I'll read somebody else's feed and have people who I don't know commenting, saying things one way or the other that I kind of go, oh my gosh, that's that's trolling, but it is a it's and it's tough to and Meg, yes, I hear you about the the prison industrial complex and how we do just sort of throw people away, and then I also realize, like, wow, this was this horrendous event, and I think the court case was good. It seemed to have done they covered all that they needed to cover, and there's certainly a fear too of people going, like, if you put him to death, he'll become a martyr, and people will be but I don't necessarily believe that. No, I haven't seen anybody making martyrs of his brother. I think people just kind of go, this is a really screwed up situation, and it's sad, and it's yeah. And I will talk about this in church on Sunday too.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure it's great fodder. Yeah. Speaking of screwed up situations that are sad, we also have the African American man shot repeatedly in the back, Walter Scott, who amazingly the police officer was found guilty, but only because a passerby happened to film the entire thing. And The Onion did a great parody about how the police officer might be convicted if these, it's broad daylight, there's somebody who films from start to finish, they don't get caught by the police, nobody, just all these conditions. But I think it's a great case study.
Because you said found guilty. No, he's been
charged with murder. Charged with murder.
And he has been fired. And he has been fired. But, I would imagine.
You're right. He's found guilty.
The whole world is going to be watching this is only the first step. And the whole world is going to be watching.
Yes. Charged with murder. And I noticed the police chief, said, well, the police officer's family's really suffering too. Of course they are. But, we're going to make sure his wife doesn't get kicked off of health insurance. And I don't want an 8-month pregnant woman to be kicked off of health insurance, but all of this compassion for a murderer compared to the lack of even interest in the thousands of murdered people is just like hair curling. So, I think it's a great case study because you can read exactly what the confidence with which he was asserting his needed to do it self-defense until they found out that it was all on videotape. And we have all of these cases where somebody wasn't so lucky to have the whole thing videotaped. But I think this will give us another chance for the community at large to talk about these issues.
Right. Did you see that GoFundMe someone had set up an account for the officer, and GoFundMe pulled it. Now it's gone over to Indiegogo, and they are allowing it. But I thought that was especially with what happened, with the whole pizza place and all this whole idea that these crowdfunding sites are now becoming a way to register your political feelings. And the fact that one of those said, no, we're not going to support this time.
Yeah, I think there's nothing quite like seeing video, and for some reason, two things stood out in my mind. First, I was really surprised that they didn't see him filming. It looked like he was pretty darn close, and it's just kind of, it almost feels, I don't know, that just really surprised me, right, that he was able to film all of that and and no one even knew he was there. Which one could say sort of maybe that has something to do with the invisibility of men of color, but I don't know. Anyway, in this case, it worked in our favor. And then the second thing was watching the officer sort of set himself, in a shooting stance with all deliberation. Because sometimes we think these things happen, they happen in the heat of the moment, and not that that's a good thing, but it's a different kind of thing than to see someone just deliberately, like they're on a shooting range.
Like a hunter. Right? Like a hunter.
Right. Right. I mean, he set himself. It's just like, wow. Wow. And then to see him also drop the taser, go and pick the thing up and basically plant it, right? And so, I don't know. There was the deliberation of the whole thing was shocking to me as well as the actual event.
And there's supposed to be more video coming out today from the cruiser, like the police car's dashboard camera as well, which you hadn't heard about until the other video footage had come out. So
right, which makes me I can't help it. It makes me suspect. I'm really curious to see what it's going to, why did it take so long? Why has it been days after the other? I don't know. I guess I'm kind of cynical. I'm sort of waiting. As Joanna said, he's been accused of. He hasn't been convicted of, so we'll see.
I don't find the two events unrelated in any number of ways. And the way that I was thinking about it, I was in Statesboro, Georgia this last weekend preaching for Easter, and I preached on empathy. And one of the things that I just think about in terms of this case is how disconnected we've become as a society to other people. How do we have any kind of responsibility to anyone who's around us? How does this 20-year-old kid not have a support group beyond his brother? How does a police officer who is there to keep people safe get through a system where clearly such an action as what he did can occur? And where is the greater thinking about what it means to be a country? It just seems like one of the shifts that has happened in the United States in my lifetime in particular is we have moved to a culture of fear and individualism that goes beyond any sense of a connection. And part of that comes from having lived 3 years in Canada, where I didn't get that at all. It was like there was just a sense of connection to one another, just 2 hours north of where Asia is right now, that you didn't feel as soon as you crossed the border.
I remember when my Canadian niece came and lived with me when she was 18, and 18-year-old white woman, terrified to walk around Washington, D.C., just terrified about what would happen to her. And actually things did happen to her a lot, with police stopping her and demanding ID and stuff. And I don't know if it was because she was young or because she was scared, and they were picking up, like, why is that woman so scared? I think when she saw police, she was just really terrified of them. And it's because I think partly of the news that goes to Canada about who we are as a country. Because when she came and she was like, oh, I'm so scared, I was like, what? And she was like, it's a police state here. And I was like, what? But just, I think in a way she saw it probably a lot more the way that a lot of oppressed people feel all the time, and it was my privilege making me go, no, we're not a police state. What do you mean? So interesting. Joanna, you want one more word on this, then we're going to move into search.
Yeah, just this whole thing of what fear does in our brains to our choices. And I was thinking about this because so for those who don't know, the amygdala is your lizard brain, and that's what controls your emotions. And prefrontal cortex, that's what's about judgment and things. And with my children, we have started telling that, when they get to that point, or we do, where you're just illogical, it's just, the amygdala firing and you're just all emotions, we will say, you need to go soothe your amygdala before we can have a discussion. Yes, preachers' kids, all the jokes. But I was, but with everything happening this week, just thinking about that, I mean, whether it is an officer whose amygdala is firing, I mean, the research on this says when that amygdala starts firing, your brain stops working, right? You can't make good decisions. And so when you think both about those things in the moment, like an officer shooting someone, or what I think is the very calculated way of doing this, like Fox News, where everything is about fear, 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 and trying to get that amygdala firing, again, so that you won't make good, rational decisions. So that's what I've been.
That's really interesting, because at our board meeting we have Adam Gerhardstein, who's now a lawyer who is working in a firm that does a lot of these police brutality cases, and he said to me, have you ever heard of the reptile brain? And I said, yeah, totally. He said, well, that's what comes up in all of these cases. That's what is brought up in the defense of police in all of these cases. So the amygdala, lizard brain, whatever you want to call it, reptile brain, apparently.
But how do we train our police?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Do we train them to make the amygdala bigger and to fire quicker? I mean,
we train them to escalate it as quickly as possible in most places. And I keep saying it's not a few bad apples. It's the tree and the soil that the tree is planted in. It's not. Oh, that one. There was something wrong with that one. That one grew right from the tree. So, well, a dramatic change in topic here. But we've got Keith Kron talking. We're going to have you back in the days of tension when everyone wondered what was going to happen. Now a lot of things have settled down. And, of course, we have the hot stove report here with Hank, who knows a lot about what's going on. So, Keith, is your office settled down now? Is it calming?
Fire has...
Enough that you were able to go to Georgia.
The world has changed, Hank. Another way the world has changed is you can pretty much do your work from anywhere. I mean, it's like, one fire is out and a new fire is started in many ways, because we move right from settle to all of a sudden helping congregations gear up for interim ministry and transitions of whatever, some of which was expected and some of which wasn't. So.
So how many churches were in search? How many found someone? How many are going into second round? Just give us some numbers.
We had about 42 congregations in search. 35 have come up with a candidate. 7 did not. 2 have already decided to wait a year and just do another year of transition. 5 are entering into a second round, which will start on Monday. Ministers and congregations are proceeding through contract negotiations and background checks and arranging for candidating weeks, all of which is going fairly smoothly at this point. And other congregations are now gearing up for getting an interim, figuring out what's best for them, and figuring out how to move forward. And we're now at the point of getting a lot of phone calls from board chairs who it's like, we just learned our minister is leaving, what do we do? And so we walk them through that process. I mean, there were 45 congregations in search for a settled minister. That's been fairly typical. Last year was the only year in my tenure that was different, because there were 70. And we kept wondering why we were going crazy last year, and it was the time and a half basically that we were putting in with all those congregations in search. We have another 11 congregations or so that are moving toward developmental ministry this particular year.
We
And
can
another
call that out, Keith, for people who are going, what's developmental ministry?
Developmental ministry is for congregations that realize they have significant issues that they need to work on that are going to take longer than a 2-year interim period in which to really work out, and that calling a settled minister is not the best option for them at this particular point, but to really focus on those goals and to try and find a minister to work with them on achieving those goals.
And that's like 3 to 5 years, is that right?
3 to 5, we're seeing more and more of them move toward 5, because to really tackle what it is that you want to tackle, you just sort of can't just jump right into it.
Are there any generalizations you would make about those churches? Do they tend to be mid-sized, small, large, old, young?
We see a lot of there are a lot of congregations that are interested in this because they think it's a way to get around the search process. So we spend a lot of time telling people this is not for you, because we're not talking about chronic issues. And then there are a lot of congregations that are in that we can barely afford a full-time minister range, who think the answer is a developmental ministry to help them figure out how to raise more money, as opposed to looking at the culture that's beneath the congregation that keeps them at 107, 110, 115, 89 members, whatever it is. But primarily the congregation is designed for congregations that's sort of like, okay, we've been through 4 ministers in 6 years and it doesn't seem to work out. Or the congregation that goes, we keep coming back to the same argument. Should we keep this building or should we go to another space? And how do we deal with a conflict that's within our congregation? We see a lot of congregations who have had significant ruptures in trust with ministry due to misconduct of some kind or some incident that's happened, that are realizing we have to do some intentional work around this that needs attention to.
Right, and do they say give us developmental ministry, or is this something that your office says, hey, we've noticed this. Have you thought about developmental ministry? I mean, how does that work? It's a fairly new thing, I think.
Right, it's fairly new. The most successful ones have actually come from congregations where they've had an interim minister who says, you know what, this is just going to take longer than 1 to 2 year interim time. There are some significant things, and I'm not going to solve your problems, and it really has to be you all figuring out how you're going to solve your problems. I think that those are the congregations where it has been most successful, and where we've seen congregations be able to move forward is the ones who are really clear that they have some work to do. They are very clear about what it is they have to do, and they are engaging with a minister who is not there to fix it, but to help them sort of look at the issues and the meta issues around what they want to change so that they can improve the culture of the congregation.
Keith, I've always wanted to ask you how much influence you think you have, or the transitions office, in when you have conversations with search committees. Do you find yourself so subtly steering them toward a better match, a worse match, or do you know in your head, one minister who desperately wants X congregation would be a terrible fit? Do you talk directly to the minister? How does that work?
Well, let me just say, Aisha, I think this is the first time you've had a question for me that you've waited to ask it. Because usually you're right out there with the questions. I really see my work here is to reduce the anxiety of the congregation and the ministers so that they can make the best decisions possible. And I have literally watched kind of going,
a fine job you do.
and to I have seen places where it's like, if the dominoes fall this way, this is going to work out. If they don't fall this way, it's not going to work out. And I really am quite clear that it's not my job to worry about where the dominoes are going to fall. It's really my job for the congregations and for the ministers to make the best decisions they possibly can, and even at times go against what I think is my good judgment, though it probably always isn't, and let them make decisions that I don't think are particularly good. I mean, I just think that's just part of the process, and sometimes, I look at sometimes for for some congregations and ministers, making decisions, and I'm going, this isn't going to work out. And I'll try and raise questions to get them to think about this more clearly. But if they're unwilling to engage and do that, it's like I'm generally not going to be heavy-handed about it. It's just sort of like, I'm going to trust that you all are adults in this process. You're going to make the best decisions you can at this particular time in this particular way, and it's going to work out in the way that it is. And what's interesting about that is that, one, sometimes my judgment is wrong and it does work out. And the other thing is, sometimes I have congregations and ministers who will come back to me and said, I wish I had listened to you better. And I think both of those things are true. And and part of what I do is try and learn as much about the culture of the different congregations and the personalities of the ministers, so I can begin to see where the good matches are.
Keith, do you think how much do you think that the UUA presidency campaign is affecting the folks who are applying for churches this year?
I have no idea. And I say that just simply because of all the UUA staff people. I think I live in a bubble more than any other UUA staff person, because literally my job is focused on the congregations and the search committees, and it is more than enough for me to pay attention to all of that as I go through the process. I mean, I sort of hear other things. There are things that people want me to participate in. It's like, that's a great idea. If it happens in the summer, I can do it. If it's happening in the middle of the high part of my search cycle, it's probably not a good idea, because you're taking a day away from me in which I can get X, Y, and Z done. That just sort of backs up.
Now, we've seen all the new changes at UUA.org, which are awesome and really great. However, the search pages that both ministers and congregations fill out is still pretty 20th century. And I have to say, like, there's a part of me, there's one question on there that I always look at and I kind of go, it hasn't been updated. And it's the question that asks congregations, does your minister have to live in the parsonage? And it's not, does your congregation have a parsonage? How will your congregation help, pay for housing? And like, so it's a very small percentage of churches that have parsonages, and even a smaller number that with the ministry has to live in that parsonage. But it's one of those things that I just kind of go, oh. Anyway, I guess the bigger question is, when will the transition stuff get updated as well, and look as snappy and snazzy as the rest of UUA?
We're working on the transitional ministry handbook right now and trying to get that updated so that people have it. Part of it has been truly just been me. I mean, one of the benefits. I am not a person. I mean,
good to know who to blame. Hank,
it is exactly. Yeah, it's like I haven't wanted to jump right in and change all the materials until I've seen the cycle go through any number of times. Because, I mean, if I were to have based everything on last year, all the information for the other 4 years would have been completely wrong, because it was completely different. So I have been slow in making changes until I have some sense of what normal is and what isn't, what's helpful and what's not. One of the things that we've tried to do in the last couple of years, which I think has been particularly useful, is we put ministers in search and search committees on separate email lists to give them more direct and up-to-date information than what's in the manuals, to help them think about things at particular times. Because one of my frustrations with all of the materials, it's sort of like it's all right there in one PDF packet, and it's not easily searchable, and you can't expect everyone to remember everything that is in that particular packet once they've read it, or even go back and find it. And that's just not how we find information these days. So we're working on it. It's all in process. Hopefully by the next search cycle it will be done. One of the complicating issues there, as we've been talking about, also about getting a new settlement system in general, which could change all of the materials that are in the manual, so that, we are currently right now dealing with a 1998 settlement system. And it is clunky, because 1998 was clunky when you were in the computer world. And we've had computer folks come in and look and see what we have to do in order to make it work, and and thankfully they roll their eyes just like we roll their eyes as they figure out how we have to jury rig different things. And
did it make a
and
difference
so
to move? Like all the packets are online now, right? They're all they're not
Yep.
physical notebooks like we used to make.
Right.
Has that made a difference, do you think, in the search process?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and it's been really useful in any number of ways. And any minister who is out there, regardless of whether you are in search or not, you should have some sort of web presence out there, and be mindful that people are looking at it, to be sure. But I just think that what happens is, what I find I'm dealing with sometimes is there are ministers who are mid to late career who decide to go into search for one last time, and they're navigating how do they create a packet and a website and not have their congregation find out.
So,
Because I'll tell you this, sometimes when you Google a person's name, their search packet comes up.
You bet.
I don't think they know that. And I'm like, oh my goodness, are you aware that, like...
What's interesting about that, Meg, is that we don't get the stories of people saying they've been found out. So
I should tell someone this?
I mean, it's like, we don't hear stories of we learned our minister was in search.
Oh, yeah.
And that, but it does raise the interesting question of, is it going to be more and more impossible for someone to be in search and not have their congregations know or find out? And that is something that seems looming. One of the interesting things that is happening is we have more and more ministers who, regardless of whether they get a position or not, feel out of a sense of ethic that they need to tell at least the leadership of their congregation that they're in search, whether it's for one specific congregation or in general, just because they think it's the right thing to do.
So one thing that I think would be really great is to have the ability to let ministers have a web presence somehow on the UUA server, where just a really simple interface, basically where it can be password protected. Because when I went out and was kind of looking for a password protected place to put my packet up, I was lucky enough to have an old website that I had when I had my company, and so I ended up using that. But it was, I really was trying not to use that, and it was kind of tricky to find a place that I thought was really protected. So that would be another cool thing to have in the back. But I want to throw some love though to Hot Stove and to Keith. Hot Stove actually posted some information from Keith on sort of what to look for in in the contract having to do with benefits and whatnot. And I thought putting that on Hot Stove was a very cool place to do that.
Thanks, because it's not just for, it's important stuff for ministers to see, and sometimes ministers don't always go to the UUA MA sites or whatever, but it's also good for the congregations to see.
It's very good. It's very good. And what we find, and what I actually recommend, because is to remind both congregation and minister, is that this is not a business proposition in the same way that it is in the corporate world. And we occasionally see people who are on negotiating teams for congregations who come from an accounting background or come from a legal background, and they sort of expect their new minister to be able to navigate heavy corporate accounting kind of information. And it's like, folks, this is not why people became ministers. They didn't become ministers to be able to do all of this. And this is why we have a standard contract recommendation for people to follow. And there is a hope for an intention of goodwill on the part of both congregation and minister to work together with something that is fair, just, and livable for both congregation and for minister as they go through the search. And contract negotiations are often complicated, and unfortunately we see often ministers cave just simply because they're afraid they're not going to have a job if they don't cave to particular contract expectations, and we also have seen congregations bend too much in the direction of someone wanting more than they should actually ask for.
I did something really interesting, Keith, right around that. So I'm the candidate in Clearwater. Meg wants to Yeah.
Yay!
And I'm thrilled, excited.
Yay! We're so excited.
Yeah, and so am I. And at this point, I'm like, I leave in 2 days, so I'm a little frazzled, but I'm so looking forward to it. But Keith, one of the things that I did in contract negotiations is I wanted to change, and rather than the sort of you say something and then hopefully you'll come back and we'll meet in the middle kind of deal, I just said what it was. And when they came back and said, well, what do you think about this? I said, I've been there before where where it's all I'm going to say this and you come back with this. I said I'm just telling you this is what I feel for me, and I'm just giving it to you straight. I'm not doing any I'm not trying to whatever go back and forth. And it was an interesting moment because of course we are all used to doing that, right? I'm going to say this, and then you say that, and then hopefully we'll get to this here, which is what which is what we really want. And it was really fun and sweet to sort of work through that because it took them a couple minutes to kind of go, huh, and sort of like grapple with that, and then they just kind of got it, and it was a very sweet process. And for me, I felt like as soon as I started the contract negotiations that I was showing who I was and who I wanted to be with them, from that moment on. So, yeah, it's a different way of doing it, but it can...
Well, Patrice, when you say, this is generally what's done, actually a lot of research shows that that's what men do and that women tend to accept what's offered. So you're out there because you've, had a lot of experience, but I mean, I've even seen the wage gap attributed to the fact that a bunch of it, that men and women are offered the same thing, and women say yes, and men say no, I want more. So I think, more power to you for doing that, and I just want to lift up that, especially for women, that isn't always the norm. And Keith, do you see a disparity in gender pay? I'm curious.
Yeah, me too.
Well, the other thing, before I get to that question, Meg, the other thing I heard Patrice say is that she showed up to these contract negotiations such as they were as a minister, as opposed to, because one of the disconnects that happens in this process for any number of folks is that all of a sudden everyone becomes a negotiator as opposed to a search committee and a minister, holding the ministry of the congregation at the core of what it's doing, and you were able to get beyond that in terms of what you were doing. And let me just say this, and going back to Meg's question, sexism is alive and well.
Yeah, one of the things that I was gonna point out that in looking at the churches that have reported so far, none of the larger churches have called women ministers, and it's very noticeable. All of a sudden, it's so noticeable that even I, as a white guy, go, whoa, that's wow, So which I think also, which is where my question about the UUA presidency comes from, as well.
Well, let me say two conflicting things about that, Hank, and the first is to hold up Santa Barbara, where Julia Hamilton was called as an inside candidate to be the minister, and that's a 550+ congregation, and so
Santa Barbara.
And so is Kathleen in San Diego, although that was last year.
Yeah, last year. Any
outside candidates, though.
Right. That is an entire another conversation. But it's interesting because what happens is that I notice that people point to individual churches and kind of go, well, here's the exception because Kathleen's in San Diego and Julia's in Santa Barbara and on and on and on. But I ran through data services a list of our congregations and got a list of the ministers, and I looked at all the congregations that are just simply 250 members or above, and it's still a 60-40 male split. 60-40 in terms of men. And I was showing that to some folks here at the UUA, and they were all said the same thing. I had no idea it was still like that. And it's like, it is still like that. we still have work to do. We have significant work to do around sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, classism, all of the different things that happen in like the Beyond Categorical Thinking workshop for people to talk about, because we're not talking about them. And we are very good as a movement of patting ourselves on the back and going, seeing what we've done, without seeing the work that we still have to do. And it is significant. And one of the books that I've been reading to help me think more about this, that I have highly recommended just because it's entertaining. It's a book called Dataclysm, and it's by the guy who founded the OkCupid dating website. And one of the things that, based on the way that he does this, he says, I want you to know, and the subtitle for the book is Who We Are When We Think People Aren't Looking, which is, probably a real interesting tell of who we are. And in the book, he talks about how clearly racism is alive and well in the United States. Not that most of us can't see it, but I mean, it is, all of the oppressions are so endemic in terms of a part of our culture, that because we see that Julia Hamilton is now the senior minister in Santa Barbara, we pat ourselves on the back and say sexism is done.
Right. Obama is president. Racism
Exactly.
Well, one of the things I've said in my congregation is about what we are pointing to, Keith, is we're not immune from what's happening in the larger culture. So, the idea that we're liberal, progressive, blah, blah, it doesn't mean that we don't have people in positions of power who don't want to give up that power, who aren't going to step aside and say, hey, this multicultural congregation really should have a minister of color, or a woman, or a trans person. I haven't seen that. Maybe you have anecdotally, because it's hard, because there are the realities of, white men who have families to take care of and can be as progressive as anything, but aren't going to say, hey, maybe I need to find a different position to make room. So the making room part, and it's happening in our larger culture, and that's part of the fear and tension of what does it mean to step aside? What does it mean to be truly progressive? What does it mean to be an ally? I mean, we we want and aspire to be a certain voice in the world. And the reality is, how do we do that without who are we asking to give something up?
Well,
right. And one of the things, too, I think that we also need to be, careful about, even after saying all this, is that the way that we as Unitarian Universalists show our piety is often through our politics, and we need to be careful about that. We need to sort of say, like, what is it to be a liberal religious person? As someone who's been in search a lot, there certainly have been times, when I'm limited to a specific area, but I tend to the people who get the positions often tend to be women, and I wonder sometimes, like, is that because, well, the last minister was a man, and they sort of think, well, we're going to do this too, and and that could just be me being angry, but I think it's truer. You see it in smaller congregations where people are much more willing to sort of say, let's look at the culture, let's look at our stuff, and in the larger congregations, kind of going, well, this is great, but we have got a multiple number of 100 members, and we're going to go with this person who's got a background in business or this or that, rather than what we need and what we as a movement need.
Well, let me jump in on both. I know Joanna wanted to say something, but there are two things that I had immediate thoughts about. Aisha, part of what you were talking about, I just kept coming back to, yes, but people want it to be easy, and we think we have gotten to the point where it should be easy, and it isn't easy, because we're taking a look at systematic natures of the way things have happened, systematic natures of oppression, and that's just hard work. And Hank, your point is interesting in that one of the things that I notice, and who knows from what bias I'm looking at all of this, what I often see in congregations is what I would refer to, we think these candidates are fairly equal, therefore we're going to pick the person who is not what we just had. I mean, what I hear from search committees is we could pick 2 people or 3 people, and therefore we're going with a man because our last 3 ministers have been women. I mean, they won't say that, but you just sort of look at the data and you kind of go, okay, you just sort of see this again and again and again. We've had 2 men and now they pick a woman. We had 2 women and now they pick a man. And you just sort of wonder how much of this actually happens on a conscious and unconscious level. Because I think these factors are still in play. And then there's the bias about, in terms of, ask the questions about larger congregations. Is there a tipping point enough of a balance within a UU congregation where calling a woman to be the minister of a larger congregation is just going to disappoint too many of the men, disappoint being a kind word, to the point where it doesn't happen? I mean, because it's, I would say that the majority of the folks in some of our large congregations would be like, the next senior minister could be a woman. But if there is a group of folks within the congregation who are dead set against it, you can have that group of folks pretty much derail the process.
So, Keith, I had a way more pragmatic question, and mine is, how has social media changed this whole process? Because I was doing this a year ago, as you know, with Live Oak. I'm so happy to be there. But the coordination of making the announcement. Now, granted, I was at a multi-site, so I had like 3 sites that we had to notify all at the same time. But just the coordination and the anxiety around, okay, but if you announce it at your church, then someone may post on Facebook about it, and we want our people to find out from us and not from Facebook, and then I remember having, like a much older colleague who said something about, what? You're announcing your candidacy. In my day, we didn't do that. We just went off quietly and candidated. Of course, several people were like, that's impossible now.
On my horse, I rode off.
I actually want to say that I found out that my candidacy had gone live on Hot Stove because I'm working during the day, so I'm not checking I wasn't able to check my email every minute and check to see and blah blah blah. And actually, it was my wife who called and said, "You made it! You're on Hot Stove." That was a very fun moment that I will always remember fondly.
I bet. Well, Joanna, your question is interesting because we spend a lot of time with search committees kind of going, you've got to be respectful of the minister who's leaving the particular congregation that they are serving. They have to do this in their own particular time, in their own particular way. You want to make sure you have the contract negotiations finished and finalized and ideally signed. Ideally, you want to have the background check done on the minister because you would hate to make this announcement to a congregation then discover something in a background check that would make you withdraw it. Though we've only had 2 turn up positive in 5 years for minor things, but still, you just want to be sure. But we also really talk to the ministers in the congregation about what is the best process for letting people know. How do you let people know? How do you let people prepare? How do you talk to your congregation if you're leaving that congregation to go somewhere else? And how do you do it in a very short period of time? Because once it's out there, I mean, you cannot keep it from the public realm for very long. Even if you tell 1 or 2 people, it's going to be out there. Even if you think you've not put it on social media, I mean, it's all there. In many ways, people are very mindful of that, and it generally works out pretty well. I think the various social media websites are good in the fact that they often help the congregation and the minister feel really good about having come to this particular point in the process. It's a way of celebrating. It's a place to direct people to, where you can give more information that people can refer to. But it's also a place where if you're not careful, some less than great things can happen because the most underrated aspects of ministry are entering and leaving the congregation. And if hard feelings develop over the departure of a minister, that will affect how people view the ministry more than any other single thing that the minister has done.
Wow.
And so so often, as you know, as Patrice and Clearwater are all celebrating this new venture, I mean, it's important just to remember that at some point you're going to leave this congregation. You are not going to be with. I mean, it is inevitable.
Debbie Downer.
whether you're there for,
it may be in a body bag, but
right, exactly. In 30 years, you or Joanna may be leaving, or it may be 5 years, or you never know how long it's going to be. But what people seem to forget at this particular point is at some point ministries will end. And paying attention to how we enter a system and how we depart a system are vitally.
So when you dedicate babies, do you say, someday you're going to die, little baby? No, I wanted to ask you one more question because we're running out of time. I've heard talk about moving to a fall and a spring search. Is that happening? Is there a twice?
We offer it. We still offer it. We're trying to get congregations to do it. It's going to be a matter. This is a place where we are more conservative than any other denomination in the United States.
And thus the hot stove,
because we are more tied to an academic calendar than any other denomination that is out there. And ministers do not want to search for spring openings unless it's a really attractive congregation. Oh, two other colleagues we should call out, Hank. Lissa Gundlach going to Pasadena mid-year congregation. Leslie Takahashi Morris called as a senior minister at Walnut Creek. I mean, so, but anyway, but there is resistance to going because UCC, Disciples, Methodists, Presbyterians, all settle at any time during the year. And you mention this to ministers, and at best they sort of look at you, and at worst they kind of go, I don't want to be in search year-round.
I bet seminarians would like it.
Well, what we actually did is I adjusted our search cycle to at least better match some seminarians to be able to enter the search process easier than they were, because I pushed things back a month to allow for an extra MSc visit to allow people to enter into the settled search as opposed to having to wait a year and a half.
Well, clearly there's a lot afoot, and this has been really interesting conversation with good news from Patrice to celebrate. Yay. And Keith, thank you so much for all of your work. You just plug away at it. And Hank, you do this great volunteer job for all of us by keeping us with one place to go to get all the news. And I would imagine this week will be the Hot Stove Report's biggest reporting week after Sunday.
I have to say that I was really surprised how many people reported last week.
On Easter, yeah, I was surprised
Easter,
too.
I mean, and actually, and I mean, certainly on Easter, but also just this week, and not everybody were new to ministry, so people had already I have a thing about you can't post, until I have a message from the church that's inviting the person on. So that's I'm betting that the people have already told their congregations that they're leaving, that sort of thing.
Yep,
and so,
they have, and a shout out to you, Hank. We used the hot stove report in the transitions office to know who had publicly announced and who hadn't, because we lose some of those details, and it's we could just go to Facebook and find out. It was great.
Fabulous. Well, thanks so much, Keith, and looking forward to a great week with drizzle and cold everywhere. No, with whatever weather you've got. Soon you'll be back in sunny Florida, more like California.
It's 86 today. Where
that sounds horrible. Give me the cold any day. Anyway, thanks for being here. Thanks for spending the hour with us. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye, folks.